Quiero iniciar la conversación de hoy con
I'd like to
algunos
begin
datos.
today's
Las mujeres se ganan
conversation
un
with some
23%
information.
menos que
Women
los
earn
hombres y esta brecha ha
23%
aumentado
less
por
than men,
cuatro
and this
puntos desde
gap
los
has
80.
grown by
Y
4
eso no es
points
todo.
since
La
the year
presencia femenina
2000,
en
and
los
that's
sectores
not all.
mejor pagados, como el
Female
sector de salud,
presence in the
las
best paid
ciencias de la
sectors like
computación o la
health,
ingeniería, es del
computer
35%.
science, or
Esto
engineering
nos
is
sorprende cuando también los
33%.
datos nos dicen
This
que
is
las
not
mujeres
surprising
emplean
when
más
the
del
data
doble
also
o más
tells
de
us
horas
that
que los hombres
women
a tareas de
work
cuidados,
twice as
tareas
many hours as
domésticas y poco
men on
remuneradas.
unpaid care
En el
and
Banco
housework.
Interamericano de Desarrollo tenemos
At the
objetivos
IDB,
claros como
we
reducir la
have
pobreza y
clear
desigualdad
objectives
e impulsar
reducing
el
poverty and
crecimiento
inequality
sostenible.
and promoting
Y también sabemos
sustainable
que esto
growth.
no es posible si no
We
reducimos
also
las
know that this is
desigualdades de
not
género.
possible if we
Mi
don't
nombre es Ana
close the
María
gender
Ibáñez
gap
Londoño,
and
vicepresidenta de
inequalities. My name
sectores
is
de
Ana Maria
SMIC,
Londoño. I'm
y
the
es
Vice
un
President for
placer ser
Sectors at
parte
the
del primer
IDB, and it is a true
capítulo
pleasure
de
to be
Miradas
here for the
Líderes, un
first
espacio de
chapter
intercambio entre
of Leader
líderes de
Insights,
América
a
Latina y
space
el
for
Caribe.
exchange among Latin
Hoy me
American and
acompaña Michelle
Caribbean
Bachelet,
leaders.
dos
Today,
veces
with me
presidenta
is
de
Michelle
Chile,
Bachelet,
líder en
twice
derechos humanos,
President of
una
Chile,
mujer que le ha dedicado su
a
vida a
leader
avanzar la
in the
igualdad de
sector of
género
human
desde
rights, and she
diferentes
has
puestos de
devoted
liderazgo
her
en
life
Bogotá. Su
to
trayectoria
defending
profesional es admirable y para mí
women
es un
in the
honor estar
positions
hoy
in
con
which she has
ustedes en
served.
esta
It's an honor
conversación.
for me to be
Presidenta
with you
Bachelet,
today
bienvenida
for
al
this
programa.
conversation. President Bachelet, welcome to the IDB.
Thank you, Ana Maria. And I wanted to congratulate the IDB on this initiative. I think that it is very important that the women in the region have this connection and have conversations of this type with people who have played different roles, trying to
Sí, para
always
las
do their
mujeres es muy
best.
importante
And for women, it is very
como
important to
Bachelet, que
hear a
realmente
woman like you,
ha hecho una
Madam
labor
President,
importante para las
because
mujeres de la
you
región.
work very
Todos
hard
tenemos en la vida
for the women
momentos
in
que
the
nos han
region.
inspirado y definido nuestro
We
camino.
all
En mi
have
caso tengo
points in our lives that
conmigo
have
un momento
inspired us
importante que
and
reforzó mi
helped
decisión
us
de
find our
continuar
path. In
trabajando en
my
temas de
case,
desigualdad.
I
Fui académica y mi
had an
investigación se
experience that
concentraba en las
inspired me
víctimas
to
de la
work
violencia en
in
Colombia.
development. In
Hicimos
my
una
work in
encuesta para
Colombia,
mujeres
I
embarazada
focused
en
on
Colombia. El
women
trabajo de
victims of
campo era
violence.
devastador.
We looked
Recuerdo
at the
mucho un
impact
hombre
of
que había sido
working in the
agricultor
fields on
y vivía
women.
en un barrio
There was a
informal de
man
Bogotá
who had been a
para
farmer and lived in
autosuficiencia.
an
Un
informal
pequeño
neighborhood in
jardín
Bogota,
con
and
una
he had a
huerta
small
tenía
garden
varios vegetales y
with
sus
a
frutas
vegetable
y flores
garden.
que había cultivado.
And there
Era
were
un
also
símbolo de
flowers around his
dignidad
home.
el medio de la
This was a
dificultad.
sign of
Esto reforzó
dignity
mi
in the midst
compromiso
of
con todos
difficulty.
quienes
This
ignoran la
reinforced
pobreza.
my
¿Qué
commitment to
inspiró
give
a
a
Michelle
voice to those
Bachelet
who
para
did
que
not
sea
have
hoy
it.
Michelle
I'd like to
Bachelet?
ask you, what inspired you to become the Michelle Bachelet we know
Well,
today?
I think that perhaps it was my family, the values that I learned at home, the concern, taking care of others. My family always said that everyone was entitled to the same rights, that all people deserved respect and dignity, regardless of socioeconomic status, gender, ethnia, etc. So all of that means that you grow up in an environment that is quite stimulating. You learn to care for others. And then second, I would say my mother. My mother always said that I, as a woman, of course, I could get married, I could have children, but that wasn't my only possibility, that I should live up to my ideals, I should get an education, I should engage in projects, and that whatever I did, I should do well. And another experience that affected me was the dictatorship in our country, exile, because uh, working with my mother, living with my father, all of this was important and left its mark. But also, I wanted to tell you something that led me to study medicine and to fight inequality. I had a boyfriend, and one day he had a really bad toothache. And so he was taken to the public health facility, and we waited for hours and hours. And I saw what public health care was like. And I said, this is impossible. It can't be that someone who doesn't have the money to pay for private care has to live through this pain, this long wait to be served, but poorly. And so here, of course, I was still going to school, but I decided I'd study medicine. And I had that vocation for public service, and I saw that education could help me solve some deep-rooted problems in my country, and not only by giving palliatives. Now, that is something that I have applied not only in medicine, but in other things,
And you
policy.
mentioned the number of important things, the role of the family, of mothers, and the importance of having and sharing that dignity in public office. I think that should be one objective that guides us all. Now, I'd also like to hear about beginnings of your career. Many young professionals or women who are watching may wonder how you went from being a young medical student to becoming the first women president of Chile. What obstacles did you encounter, and how did you manage to reach this point?
There's a saying, and perhaps I'm not giving you the exact translation, but you turn out to be what you were meant to be. And so when I was at school, I was always coming up with initiatives. I was president of my class. So right from the beginning, I was engaged. I was an active person. I wasn't passive. Every time that there was a question, I would raise my hand or I would suggest something. So I say that because it's just part of my personality. And as I said, my family environment was enriching. My family was a resilient, loving family. And so I always felt that I had that backing. I did study medicine and I became a zone manager. I worked with the poorest population. But before that, I was studying medicine when the dictatorship was installed. So I left the country with my mother. I went to Germany. I continued my studies. Then I went back to Chile and continued my studies. And I had worked as an advisor to the Ministry of Health. And then I was minister. But to answer your question, there had been a coup in Chile. There was an important thing happening in the political world. The military, the political environment was complicated. I had been involved in politics right from when I was young, and then I joined a political party. I joined Juventud Política. So with this political military environment in Chile, I had to understand, and I never ever thought that I would become even a minister, much less a president, because I saw the military in power. And so then I decided that I was going to go to the National Academy of Strategic Policy Studies, and there I won an award, and I was sent to the Inter-American Defense College here in Washington, D.C. And after that, I went back to Chile. So first of all, I became Minister of Health, but then I did all of that being Minister of Health. And then I came to the United States to study, and when I returned, I was appointed Minister of Defense. So that was a very important post. And I want to comment on that for those of you who may be interested. As Minister of Health, I was a caregiver, a caretaker. I took care of everybody. So no one could imagine that I could be President of the Republic. And that's when I was appointed Minister of Defense. That is when people began to see me in another dimension, as someone with other alternatives. So I was the first female Minister of Defense in Chile. I was the fifth female Minister of Defense in the whole world, and that shows how little women are represented in those high-ranking positions. And so that was important. And with that portfolio, and in 2002 with the floods in Chile, we used the soldiers to help clean up the streets. And I went out to review the work being done, and you couldn't go in a car because the water was too high. So I was taken in a military vehicle that could go through those high waters. And I'm saying this because it is symbolic. People need to be able to see women in positions of power. And for that, there has to be symbols. Otherwise, we women, we always have to be showing that we're powerful, that we're strong. And I say that because of the pictures that were taken visiting these flooded areas, those pictures were in the press. So people had seen me before as Minister of Health, the Minister of Defense, but perhaps I was just seen in a different light. And I have an anecdote. It has something to do with the politicians. Politicians were asking me, could you lend me that high water vehicle for the weekend? So everyone realized that that was a turning point. And for women, I think that we have to think of symbols. How can we have access to certain positions that allow people to see that we women are capable, we're powerful for a lot of things, and that you can perfectly well become president or a parliamentarian or a senator?
Cuando fue esa foto suya, yo era una muy
And
joven que estaba
when that photograph came out, I
estudiando
was a young
después
woman.
de
I
haber
was just
terminado la
starting my
universidad.
professional
Y
career,
recuerdo
having
vívidamente,
completed my PhD
recuerdo
studies, and I
vívidamente
remember that photo
y el
very
símbolo pues
clearly
de ver
and what
a
happened
la
after,
ministra
how
de
it
Defensa de
became
Chile
a symbol.
haciendo eso. Entonces, esos son
Seeing
símbolos
the
que
Minister of
realmente nos
Defense of
llevan
Chile,
a
Michelle
todas las
Bachelet,
mujeres a
in that
decirnos
light. So
que
I
se
think
puede.
that
Y no
should
solamente se puede,
be a
sino que se
message
puede
to all
hacer y se
women,
puede hacer muy bien, como lo
a
hizo
message just
usted.
saying,
Y
yes,
eso
we
es
can. Not
muy
only,
importante para las mujeres.
yes, we can, but we can do it well.
Right, and you can do that as a woman. Something that many women leaders do is they feel that to be respected as a leader, they have to behave as a man. And my option was, no, I'm not going to do that. If people want to appreciate me, it has to be that they appreciate me as I am. So when I was Minister of Defense, I would say to someone, could you please do something? And people would say, don't be so polite. People aren't going to respect you. Often people feel that they have to use bad language to assert their power. But in wearing a uniform, you have to still be a woman. So sometimes if I couldn't be at a meeting, people would say, what happened? Why wasn't she here? So you have to be who you are to be respected as a person, and we cannot set aside our very nature. We have to continue to be women, and we have to be respected as we are. And you know why that is so important? Especially for those who want to engage in politics, it's because it's more genuine, and people can acknowledge that you're being genuine, that you're not disguising yourself, you're not trying to be something that you aren't. Now, just the very fact, and of course, it won't last for forever, you have to be who you are.
Sí,
And
es
that
no perder la
despite the
esencia
task.
Yes,
en los puestos de
not
liderazgo y sobre todo los
losing your
hombres donde
essence
somos una
when
figura monolítica en donde todas somos iguales. Y creo que
serving
parte
as a
del éxito de las
leader.
mujeres
People
es
have the impression that
ser
women are all the
diferentes entre
same,
nosotras.
and that is not true. There are many different types of women.
Thus, you shouldn't lose your sense of humor. That day, since that water was so high, we had a meeting in the community, the emergency committee, and we met with the president. And that is when I said to the president, I just did this and that and the other. So I was reporting. And I said, okay, I was on a MOAC, but just don't believe that this was a coup. And of course, people laughed when I said that to the president. And I think that people feel more relaxed. Of course, you have to see when humor is appropriate. But that too is part of my personality. So you just have to be yourself.
I think that is very important. President, as you were talking about your early days, made me think of a number of things. Recent information from Gender Gap indicates that women would need 131 years to achieve gender parity. These figures can be demoralizing and can make our work seem meaningless. Women professionals know that we need to work harder with more rigor and commitment than men in order to have the same opportunities. I have felt that at times, and I have to confess that does not disappoint me, just the opposite. It gives me more energy to continue working even harder. What motivates you on your day to day to work for things that seem unachievable?
It's true. Some days your enthusiasm may fail you. Not every day are things brilliant. Not every day are you full of hope. But nonetheless, there is something that motivates me a lot from all standpoints. And it is that if you have had the privilege, not privilege in terms of inadequate uses of privilege, if you've had the opportunity to represent your country in different arenas, you have to be the voice of those who haven't had those opportunities, those possibilities. Also, we know that for things to change, women have had to struggle for years. They have had to break through all of the glass ceilings that have been imposed on us. So it's important to realize that we're not alone, that we reach where we are now because we stand on the shoulder of other women that did blaze this path. Now, in the case of Chile, for example, we women could not study medicine until 1848, when a minister of education decided that we could study medicine. But for women to be able to go in class, there was a screen put between the women and the men. And the excuse was that they didn't want men to not be able to concentrate because they would be looking at women, or if it was an anatomy class, it was because the cadaver had no clothes. So we have to tear down the screens that still do exist in many places. And in many places, there are biases, biases that are self-evident, but others that are invisible, and they have to be torn down. We in Chile had wonderful women, uh, Arenas, for example, that always defended women's rights. But what is also true, and this is something I've learned, is that the struggle to attain women's rights never comes to an end. When there is a universal agreement on whatever, you discover that that agreement really doesn't have full effect. There are always people trying to restrict the rights of women. I see that in the world today. In the United Nations, for a long time now, resolutions do not contain the word gender, or in other resolutions, there's no mention of the word women. So there has been some cultural slippage in some countries, countries where we thought that we had made good strides and that we could take these things for granted, and that is not true. Now, does that discourage me? Actually, it makes me feel that I need to fight harder. Now, excuse me, Ana Maria, for calling you tú, but when you talked to that poor man that you said motivated you to work in the area of development, I, as Commissioner for Human Rights, I would see the reality of women, their definition, their courage, how they organize, how they are leaders, even though they don't recognize that they have a leadership role, but nonetheless, they're caring for their communities. So being in the field with women does teach you that they need you, they need me, they need leaders, and they are part of solving the challenges faced by their countries, the world. And a week and a half ago, I went to the ECOSOC Forum of Young People. And of course, people probably wondered what I was doing at a youth forum, but it was an international conversation with women leaders. And I heard some very interesting women, interesting, but they are defending the rights of young people, but also the right of young women. And so despite the slippage, and let's say that women have been persistent, they and I feel that I'm not going to give up in terms of fighting for these rights. I refuse to do that because I think that you can raise your voice and be heard. And so anytime that anyone needs me to talk about things about women's rights or fighting
Yo me uno
inequality,
al me niego
they can call
arrepentimiento.
on
Me
me.
parece que es
I,
algo
like
que
you,
es muy
refuse to give
importante. Y
up,
hay dos
and I
mensajes
think it
entre
is
muchas de
very
las cosas
important.
que me
And I
parecieron muy
think there's two
necesarias.
messages
Primero,
I would take
tenemos
away.
mujeres antes de nosotras
One
que nos han
is
abierto el
that there
camino y
are
que nos han
women who
permitido
preceded us and
tener
paved the
unas
way
vidas
for
plenas como las
us.
que
They made
tenemos
it
y,
possible
y
for
tener
us to
oportunidades
lead the full
laborales
lives we
también,
lead and
dar
to have
oportunidades laborales a
job
las mujeres.
opportunities and
El
also
papel que a veces
share
juegan
those
algunos
opportunities
hombres,
with other
no somos
women.
solamente las mujeres, sino que
And it's not
necesitamos a
just
los
women, there
hombres
are
tomando la
men who have
decisión de que
also
las mujeres sí
contributed.
podrían
We
estudiar
need
medicina, por
them.
ejemplo,
For
en
example,
Chile, y eso también me
like you
parece
said,
importante. Y
men
lo
who
tercero es
decided that women
el
should be
retroceso
able
que
to
estamos
study medicine
teniendo,
in
que a
Chile.
mi juicio
So
es muy
that's one
preocupante.
point.
Yo
The other
tengo una
is the
hija de 22
backsliding
años que
we're
pronto va a
seeing.
entrar
It
al mercado laboral
troubles
y a
me.
veces veo,
I have a
si ya me
20-year-old
han
daughter who
mejorado
will
tantas cosas,
be
¿por qué le va a tocar
looking
otra
for a
vez a
job
mi hija
soon. And
enfrentar lo mismo que enfrenté yo
I
y
asked
brincar un
myself,
camino que ya
we've made
veníamos
so much
allanando?
progress. Why does she
Entonces,
have to face the
no nos
same
podemos rendir,
obstacles
tenemos
we
que seguir
faced in the
persistiendo.
past? So we cannot give up. We have to keep on
And Ana
trying.
Maria, the problem is that often women do not have a gender perspective. I remember when I was, no, I wasn't commissioner. I was executive director of UN Women. And I had had a dinner with entrepreneurs, business people, and they said, I'm good. I am good, not because I'm a woman. I am good because I am competent. And I said, right, I'm the representative because I'm competent too, but also I wanted to open the road for many other women that are excellent. They are excellent, but they have to keep proving their excellence and their capacity. So my responsibility was to pave the way for other women. But a lot of women are very self-centered. It's the me. Others do not work in that way. They value what they have achieved. But when we talk about the invisible biases, and there's a study that I read when I was higher commissioner and I was interviewed by Harvard Business Review, and there was something about an important company. I forget the name, but there was a policy for women to reach higher decision-making positions. And after 1 year, they had made zero progress. And that was year one. Year two, they asked people, why is this happening? And they discovered that there was an activity, there was a position where a man and a woman had applied. They both had good prior performance. The interview was so-so, but the results of the interview for the woman was that she was insecure, and the man did fine on the interview. So how do you deal with those biases? And in talking to the director of a very important European broadcast, she said the same thing happened to me. And she said, these are my requirements. And the woman said, look, I'm good at 7 of the 8 things, and I will try to learn. And the man came in very self-confident. and said, I'm the person you need. And I said, well, I would have hired the woman. The woman knew what her strengths were, but she also knew the area where she needed improvement. So there are invisible biases that we have to make visible because it's not only the glass ceiling. That is one component, but then we have stereotypes, we have biases that do unfortunately continue to exist in our culture, in our region, and in other parts of the
Yes,
world.
and you mentioned something that's very important, and it's our role as women in helping other women. You have worked to make that possible throughout your career to provide more access to women. And this is important. An IDB study shows that 24% of higher level positions in the public sector in 15 countries in Latin America is in the hands of women. In the case of Chile, what would you say were the most significant initiatives under your two administrations in terms of closing gender gaps, economic or political access, or in other areas? You've mentioned a few, but could you single out a few so that we can discuss them?
Perhaps the most important thing was making the decision to have an equitable cabinet, 50% men, 50% women, but also a cabinet where women could play roles not in typically feminine roles, quote, quote, in areas that were masculine from the standpoint of ministries. But often we see governments where women do hold positions, but they are in what I would call feminized roles than what women have traditionally held. Now, perhaps I had the first parity cabinet in the country. Now it's been done in Spain. It has been in other cabinets now worldwide, but I think our cabinet was perhaps the first. Now, in my second term, we forced the political parties in 1997 to present at least 40% of female candidates on their tickets. And if they did not do that, they could not register their list of candidates. So I wanted to say that I wanted to say it had to be 40% of those elected, but I wasn't able to accomplish that. And one of the parliamentarians said, no, the problem is if one of the women win, then we would have to step aside. So I said, okay. So he said, okay, we understand, but we don't want to give up any of our space in power either. So even though I wanted 40% elected and not 40% running for office, we were able to increase by 7 percentage points, 1.7, and right then we were advancing. And that so we went from 15.8 to 16.8 and then to 23% in Senate, which means that things are on the right track. So there is an increase there. The other thing that we did was we gave women an allowance for each children, each live birth. And that was important. Another thing that we did, well, we did much more. I'm just picking different things, but we had to increase the number of women on company boards. Now, we said we're going to begin with public companies. We could not impose this on the private sector. Back then, the percentage of women was something like 5%. And we put together different affirmative action initiatives so that in the council that assigns positions could assign women. For example, the state, when it does public procurement, we said equal quality of products, equal quality equal prices. Let's use smaller women-led companies. Of course, everything had to be good quality because otherwise women are usually left out. And then another thing that we did in my second term of office was we enacted a law that depenalized the interruption of pregnancy. If the fetus had a congenital birth defect, if we knew the child was going to die upon delivery, or if there had been a case of rape. Because I think that this affects the physical autonomy of women. We women have the right to decide how many children we want to have and when we want to have them, or if they don't want to have children. And so that ties into reproductive rights. Then something else was the right to a life free of violence. So finally, that bill was approved this year. We sent it to Congress 14 years ago. So I'm just giving you some highlights of things that we did. But you can see how we tried to narrow the gaps experienced by women for different reasons.
And you mentioned many important things, but one message I think is key is that public policies matter, and they're very important to improve women's lives and so that they can have access to opportunities under the same conditions as men. There's something I'm curious about. You've spoken about bias and invisible biases at work. How would you manage those biases at the cabinet level when you set up your cabinet with men and women? I assume that there must have been biases present, especially at difficult junctures.
Yes. When you're the president, the good thing is that you can give instructions. You can say, this is what we're going to do. And we have to fight those biases. Now, we would set goals, and the ministers had to report on how they were doing vis-a-vis those goals on women, gender, all of these things that we are discussing. And once a month, they had to report, telling us how they were doing with this goal and other goals too. And so that is not only giving an instruction that could basically vanish after a certain time goes by, but you have to monitor this. You have to get reporting. Now, most ministers back then were men. I'm talking about some ministers. There was minister, sort of older, but every time he would come to a meeting and I would say, we're going to do this, that, and the other, he would want to speak. He could not tolerate my speaking. So I had a meeting, perhaps it was in Paris, and someone asked me, so what did you do? And I said, well, I talked to him several times. I'm a very patient person. I understood the context. I understood that he was from a different generation and raised in a different culture. But finally, I asked him to resign. And it's not because I was a woman. It's because I could not work with a person who did not understand that you have been elected by your country to guide that country. So I didn't make a friend, but the truth is, if you do nothing, and if there's impunity, you have to take measures. You can talk, you can clarify things, but if things continue to happen, you have to take measures because otherwise it's like you're ignoring the problem. And if people cannot make that necessary cultural change, they're not going to be able to do their work well either, because the instruction was, look, we have to work with men, but at the same time, we have to close this tremendous gender gap in our country. And that is where you find the most marginal population. But that means that, yes, you do have to take measures.
Yes, and sometimes we have to make decisions and we have to stand by our positions. at times, and that also sets an example. And I think it's important to communicate those messages. We have been talking about changes affecting women. We know strides have been made in closing the gender gap. We have more women leaders, but there's also been some backsliding. And we also know that there's a long way to go. As a Latin American woman who's been able to help close those gaps, what is the most pressing thing would you say we need to do to achieve gender equality in the region?
There's no cookbook recipe about what we need to do, but we do have evidence that shows what has been effective in different places. So as we try to narrow this gap more quickly, we do have to consider this because we cannot wait 100 years for gender equality, or the 181 years. But for complete equality, I think that would be like 200 years. So there are some dimensions of gender inequality that are even longer than that. So I think that we need to look to the following. We need to look at education, access to education. An educated woman is healthier, has healthier children, they marry later, they have information on sexual and reproductive health, they have greater economic opportunities, and also they can participate more in their community and their societies, and they play a vital role in terms of putting an end to violence in the household. Also, we need to make major strides in the STEM area, science, technology, engineering, and technology. We have to do a lot in STEM, and these are areas that have traditionally been dominated by men. Now, that is where education comes in once again. We, especially with early education, can try to put an end to the cultural biases with the stereotypes right from the time when children are in childcare or what they see at home. And parents need to be given good examples at home. When I was little, the boy would always get the best piece off of the chicken or the bigger piece of meat. Now, we also have to look at educational rights. In some countries in the world, girls still are discriminated in terms of going to school. But it is important to educate boys so that they will learn to respect and they will consider women to be equals as peers. Then, second, we have to look at economic security, because if you invest in women's empowerment, that opens up a track for them to be elevated out of poverty. Often in our region, we see a lack of opportunities for women, and it's because of a lot of the work being informal. Something like 70% of the employees in the informal sector are women. Also, we need to have inclusive economic growth. Women make a tremendous contribution to the economy. They are entrepreneurs or they work in the private sector. And we talked about caregiving. The central bank in Chile did a study, and if the work done on caretaking, that would be 21% of GDP of the country. So that is a tremendous contribution made by women through this unpaid work. We can also provide greater access to economic activity, advance the amount of female participation in the labor market, bring down obstacles that stand in their way of their being able to borrow. For example, we know that financial literacy is important because women have less access to credit, and that affects a woman who wants to pay for her political campaign or to set up a business. And the thing is, we actually are better at paying back our debts. Now, also, we have to look at political participation. That is important for democracy and for justice. And we see that women are underrepresented in decision-making positions, and that can be improved with a quota law. And Chile is an example in that context. But these are things that I think are
And
basic.
three components that are essential, in fact. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time. I could spend hours speaking with you, Madam President. It's been a real privilege. So I would ask you to leave us with one last message, a message for the men and women who today are in a position to help close the gaps where they work, be it the public or private sector, civil society, or multilateral organizations. What is your message for
Well,
them?
the first thing that I would like to say to everyone is we all have a role to play to close this gap in all sectors, in all areas, because it's not only the thing that is ethically correct, it's not only fair, but it's also the intelligent way to cope with the challenges faced by countries, societies, the planet. So by incorporating women into all areas of activity, we will improve the performance of our companies, of governments, of organizations, community organizations, but also in multilaterals, because we women have a lot to contribute. No one is asking for favors. We just want to be given an opportunity to play those roles, to show our talents, our ability to contribute. In Chile, like in many countries of the region, we love soccer. And sometimes if I see that I am not convincing people, there was a cup to be played, and I said, could you imagine winning a soccer championship if only one half of the team plays? And in Latin America, or in the rest of the world, women represent 50% of the population. In the United Nations, that used to say minorities and vulnerable sectors. So women and children became a minority, and that's not true. We are at least half of the population. And one final message to young people, because the future is in their hands, and we need the new generations to bring new energy, new ideas to this struggle for gender equality. We have made good progress, and although that is true, there is still much yet to be done, as you said. And the young people in the world expect us to continue to support them.
So we will continue with our fight for the benefit
Right,
of
and never give up,
future
never give up.
generations.
Desmond Tutu used to say that he was a prisoner or a hostage of hope. And I think that that is true. We can build a better world. And with more women, we will have better democracy, better development. And with more women, we will have a cleaner and better planet that will be sustainable.
We will take that challenge and hopefully will succeed in our efforts. We will continue to fight for women's equality because we are half of the team. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and warm
We're
greetings
all delighted.
to
We have many of your
all
fans
the
here
people
who
that
are
work at
very
the
happy to have
IDB.
had this chance to listen to you.
Warm greetings to all of you.